I swear I can still hear the sound of my fork clattering against the plate the moment she said it, that clean, metallic echo slicing through the air like a gunshot. It was supposed to be a quiet Friday dinner at my favorite restaurant, the kind of place where the lights are low, the wine is overpriced, and the waiters call you "sir" with a smile too polished to be real. But when Jessica looked across the table, smiled like she'd just won the lottery, and said, "I'm engaged to your best friend," the entire world stopped. For a second, I thought I'd misheard. My best friend, Tyler? The same guy who helped me move apartments last summer? Who drank beer on my couch every Sunday? Who called me brother in every Instagram caption? My brain tried to make sense of her words, but they just kept looping in my head like static. I remember her tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, her diamond ring catching the soft restaurant light as if she wanted me to see it sparkle. "We've been seeing each other behind your back for about 8 months, she said casually, stabbing at her salad like she hadn't just detonated my entire reality. My first reaction wasn't anger. It was disbelief, the kind that sinks deep into your chest and makes breathing feel like a chore. My mind flashed back to every late-night work trip she'd taken, every time Tyler had bailed on plans, every message that went unanswered. The puzzle pieces clicked together so painfully that I felt physically sick. "You're joking," I managed to whisper. Jessica's smile didn't waver. Tyler wasn't there, of course. Apparently, he didn't think it was a good idea. How considerate. She leaned forward slightly, voice dipping lower as if she were telling me a secret. "It just happened, Mark. We didn't plan it." I laughed then, a sharp, bitter sound that made the couple at the next table glance over. "Didn't plan it? You don't accidentally text someone at 2 a.m. for months. You don't accidentally lie every day. You don't accidentally betray the person who would have given you everything." I remember leaving money on the table, way too much, and walking out into the cold night air before she could say another word. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely unlock my car. I didn't cry, not right away. I just sat there, staring at the steering wheel, replaying every single memory of them together. Tyler at my birthday barbecue, Jessica laughing too hard at one of his jokes, the way their eyes met for half a second longer than normal. God, I'd been so blind. By the time I got home, anger had finally replaced the numbness. I wanted to burn every photo, every souvenir, every stupid little thing that reminded me of her. But instead I did something better. I opened my laptop and started digging. Through old messages, shared drives, cloud backups, social media tags, everything. I was an IT analyst, and if there's one thing I knew how to do, it was find digital ghosts. And within 2 hours, I had proof of everything. Screenshots, photos, videos, timestamps, an entire timeline of betrayal laid out in cold, clinical order. But revenge isn't just about evidence. It's about timing. As I stared at the glowing screen, I realized Jessica's announcement dinner wasn't just a confession. It was her way of breaking the news before someone else could. She wanted to control the narrative, to make me look like the bitter ex who couldn't move on. So I decided right then that if she wanted control, I'd take it from her, slowly, publicly, and perfectly. Because if there's one thing I've learned about betrayal, it's that the best revenge isn't rage, it's precision. By dawn, I had a plan that felt less like revenge and more like a measured unraveling, each step designed to expose them without giving them room to twist the story. I wasn't going to scream or crash anyone's life. I was going to be surgical. I started small and methodical. First, I created a clean, anonymous email and a burner social account with a neutral name that wouldn't trigger anyone's suspicions, the kind of profile that blends into the noise of social media. Then I pulled up the timeline I'd built overnight. Timestamps from parking apps, location tags from photos, receipts they'd thought were private, and the love notes tucked into shared cloud folders that Jessica assumed I'd never see. Tyler had the decency to be sloppy. He synced vacation photos to an album that auto-tagged locations, and one of those tags put them at a beachfront motel 3 months ago, the same days he claimed he had a consulting gig. I downloaded everything, organized it into a folder labeled Only for Now, and took a breath. The emotional part of me wanted to post everything immediately, to watch their lives implode in real time. But the logical part, the part that remembered broken relationships and messy legal fallout, cautioned patience. If you want someone to see themselves the way you see them, you don't just fling mud, you polish it until it's a mirror. Over the next week, I became a ghost in their periphery. I followed Tyler's tagged photos and Jessica's public stories through my burner account, leaving no trace. I learned their patterns. He worked late on Tuesdays, she volunteered Saturday mornings, they always ate at the same sandwich shop at noon on Thursdays. I started seeding little believable things into that anonymous profile. A shared memory here, an innocuous comment there. Just enough to build a credible presence. People trust what looks normal. Then I moved to phase 2, influence. I reached out privately to a stringer of local bloggers and community group admins, the kind of faces whose notifications Tyler and Jessica would actually notice. I didn't lie, I hinted. Hey, small heads up, I've been seeing a pattern of coordinated posts between 2 people that seems off. Might be nothing, but thought you'd want to look. The wording was deliberately vague. Curiosity is the perfect weapon. While they sniffed around, I timed my reveals to coincide with a public moment that would maximize exposure, but minimize my direct involvement. I waited for Tyler to host his celebration poker night, the sort of casual party where mutual friends would gather and rumors spread like wildfire. On that night, I emailed the local blogger a compressed folder with the timeline and a short note explaining I wanted it handled delicately. I also dropped subtle hints into community Slack channels under my burner profile, simply asking, "Anyone else notice Tyler's travel schedule overlaps with Jessica's Insta tags? Odd?" People started talking. The best part was watching their careful little facade begin to wobble without me ever stepping into the room. Tyler texted me that week, pretending everything was normal, asking if I wanted to grab a beer. I agreed, of course I did, and spent the evening measuring his movements, noting who he hugged and how long he lingered by the patio where friends clustered. Back home, notifications started to pop up. Screenshots forwarded through group chats, a friend tagging Tyler with a meme about sneaky lovers, a polite DM from a mutual colleague asking if I knew anything. Panic, I learned, is contagious. But despite the rush, I stayed precise. I never accused publicly, never posted raw files. Instead, I let the curated dossier speak. The blogger published a careful piece that next afternoon. No names, just a narrative about 2 local figures whose public stories don't quite match their private ones, followed by a timeline that matched mine, down to the timestamps. Within hours, whispers became messages, and messages became confrontations. Jessica's ring photo, which she had posted as a triumphant announcement, was now being compared to beachfront snaps showing the same dress on different dates. Tyler's work trip receipt was paralleled by a motel booking with matching initials. Friends messaged both of them with links and pointed questions. The comfortable bubble they'd inflated began to leak. And through it all, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not bliss, not triumph, but a cool clarity. This wasn't about watching them fail. It was about reclaiming my story. I was done being the punchline in their carefully edited lives. The public was beginning to connect the dots, and by the time they realized they'd been exposed, it would be too late to control the narrative. Precision, not panic, that had been the promise I made to myself at 3 a.m., and by acting like a chess player instead of a lunatic, I'd put them into check. The night everything cracked open felt like watching a slow-motion collision, inevitable and grotesquely beautiful in the way only carefully engineered things are. And I remember the fluorescent hum of Tyler's basement like it was a soundtrack to Betrayal. He'd invited the same circle of friends who'd toasted my promotions and cheered at my stupid jokes, the same people who'd once called all of us the Three Musketeers, and I sat at the edge of the room like a man waiting to see if a surgeon's incision would take. Tyler was louder than usual, hands animated, telling a story about a wild client meeting in Miami. And Jessica, perched near the chip bowl, kept looking at him the way people look at an actor who just nailed a line, all adoration and dangerous assurance. I could have walked in guns blazing, screamed, thrown plates, forced confessions with the cruelty of someone who still thinks chaos equals victory. But by then, I'd learned that chaos feeds the liar. What shreds a lie is clarity under lights. So instead I sat, counted, and waited until the exact moment their defenses were down, when the beers were warm and the room had lulled into careless laughter. That's when I tapped the host's phone, politely, like asking to borrow a pen, and cued the slideshow I'd prepared. Timestamps, geotags, motel receipts, and side-by-side comparisons of photos with tiny EXIF details highlighted so even the most sympathetic friend couldn't argue semantics. The images filled the TV over their heads, and for a beat there was silence so thick you could hear someone's watch tick. Tyler's face drained color. He reached for his phone like a reflex, but this wasn't a private screen anymore. Friends murmured. Someone who'd known Tyler since middle school stood up and said, "Are you kidding me?" Jessica's smile, the one that had been used to disarm me at that restaurant, faltered into something raw and human. Not guilt exactly, but the sharp edge of being seen. Tyler tried to joke it off. He laughed too loud, the sound cracking like a brittle veneer. "Look, this is circumstantial, right? Timing isn't proof." But timing is a map, and the map I'd laid out had every turn marked. A woman who'd always been quietly loyal to me, the one who used to bring extra guacamole at my birthday, said, "Ty, there's no way these are fake." Another friend, the kind who didn't bother keeping peace when he smelled dishonesty, asked in a low voice why Tyler hadn't shown up at a volunteer day he'd promised to attend. Tyler stammered. Jessica's eyes flashed a plea and then something colder. Calculation. The room started to split, allies rearranging like tectonic plates. What surprised me wasn't the shock from others, but Tyler's immediate pivot into blame. "Mark, what are you doing here? Trying to sabotage my life?" His words landed like a cheap shot, meant to distract from the substance on the screen, and for a moment I felt a sting I hadn't expected. They were trying to make me the villain, the bitter ex-engineer who couldn't move on, because that's the safest role for cheaters to cast their victims in. But I stayed measured. I let others ask the hard questions while I watched them peel away excuses like dried wallpaper. Jessica cried at one point, a theatrical, damp-eyed performance that split the room between those who wanted to cradle her and those who wanted receipts. A woman from our group confronted her gently and asked, "Were you ever honest with him?" That question landed like a guillotine. Jessica's voice came out small and raw. "I didn't know how to tell him." That line, "I didn't know how to tell him," hung in the air like an admission dressed as a plea. People hate ambiguity. They crave moral clarity. And suddenly the moral calculus of the room shifted toward accountability. Tyler tried to salvage things by walking out to clear his head, and Jessica followed, leaving a messy trail of whispered conspiracies and forwarded screenshots. Outside, under the halo of the porch light, there was a scene I'd rehearsed in my head and never truly wanted to star in. Tyler, voice trembling with anger and fear, accused me of orchestrating some elaborate public humiliation. "You set me up," he spat, as if that explanation could reroute the evidence. "You planted things." I listened, because listening in the charged moment is a weapon. It gives the other person space to place their guilt on their own shoulders. When he called me a liar, something inside me uncoiled, not triumph, but a quiet tiredness that comes from being pushed into a corner and deciding you won't stay there. I told him calmly that I'd found the timeline because I was trying to understand what had happened, not to destroy him, and that if he wanted to call it setup, he could, but that didn't erase the pictures. His jaw tightened. There was shame and a flash of something like regret, and then he disappeared into the night. By morning, the group chat that had once been full of weekend plans had turned into a tribunal. Messages pinged my phone with questions I answered with the same economy I'd used in building the dossier: facts, dates, silent confirmations. There were fractured alliances and awkward texts from mutual friends pleading for explanations, for peace, for the version of our lives that existed before the slideshow. In the quiet left behind, I felt the old idea of revenge shift into something harder to name: reclamation. They'd tried to write my story for me, as the hero, the fool, the man left behind. And instead I'd become the editor, the one who decided how the final chapter read. But even as things changed, a small, insistent part of me wondered what would happen when the public curiosity faded and the private consequences remained. That question felt like the hinge between what I'd done and what I'd yet to do, and I knew the endgame was still coming. After the slideshow and the late-night accusations, the world around me didn't explode into the melodrama I'd secretly imagined. Instead, it settled into an ugly, rearranged normal, like furniture shifted after an earthquake: familiar shapes, new angles, and that hard-to-ignore sense that nothing would quite fit the same way again. The immediate fallout was merciless in its own small, quiet ways. Tyler's clients started asking awkward questions. The volunteer group he'd been angling to lead quietly reassigned him, and Jessica's social circle fractured into factions who either defended her with fierce loyalty or cut her off with the casual cruelty of people who want to believe the worst because it's easier than wrestling with nuance. I should have felt triumphant, but what I felt was a tired clarity. The cost of exposing them was real, and part of me had to admit I'd wanted a simpler ending: a dramatic confession, a public apology, a cinematic collapse. But life rarely delivers tidy finales. Instead, consequences arrived in the form of conversations. Friends I'd assumed would stay on my side called to ask how I'd gathered the proof. Others sent terse messages about fairness and privacy, and a few people I'd trusted went radio silent entirely, embarrassed to acknowledge how they'd been complicit in the blind spots that let the affair continue. I answered as honestly as I could. I had been betrayed, I had gathered facts, and I wanted to reclaim my story. Some accepted that, some didn't. In the weeks that followed, Tyler attempted damage control: half-hearted texts, offers to meet, promises that sounded like scripts. Jessica did what people do when they're cornered and scared. She apologized publicly in a way that read like PR, and privately she tried to explain the emptiness that had led her into the affair. Their pleas produced sympathetic ears, and for a moment I watched them both try to stitch their lives back together like careful seamstresses. Pity is a complicated stitch, and sometimes it heals more than it should. But the thread of my life had changed color, and I realized the only true repair I could make was to myself. I stopped collecting evidence not because I'd lost the will, but because at some point I understood that revenge had given me something I hadn't expected: a sense of agency. I used that agency not to orchestrate greater public spectacle, but to reclaim the small, meaningful parts of my life that mattered. The friends who remained were no longer extras in someone else's script. They were people who'd asked hard questions and stayed. I threw myself into work with a renewed focus, not to prove anything to them, but to rebuild a confidence that had been insidiously chipped away. I deleted the burner accounts, archived the dossier into a folder labeled "Locked," and refused to weaponize the past further. Part of healing was refusing to let past toxins define future choices. The catharsis came in unexpected forms: a Sunday morning run without replaying the scene on the restaurant stage, a late-night phone call from an old friend who'd been surprisingly steady, the small joy of cooking a meal and not waiting for betrayal to announce itself in the middle of it. Months later, Tyler reached out one last time, a message that was more honest than any of the scripted apologies. "I messed up. I'm sorry. I don't expect forgiveness." I typed a reply that was shorter than any of us imagined. Then live with it. Closure, I discovered, isn't found in revenge, but in the steady, often boring work of living well afterward. As for Jessica, she moved away to a small coastal town 2 states over and started a job that had nothing to do with our mutual friends. Occasionally, I'd see a tagged photo of her, walking a dog or staring at a sunrise, and the sight no longer detonated anything inside me. The community gossip cycle faded as new scandals and celebrations took center stage, proving how mortal public outrage is. Loud and quick to rise, quicker still to forget. In the quiet aftermath, I rebuilt boundaries and learned the rare discipline of being choosy about who gets access to my life. I dated again slowly, like someone easing into a cold lake, testing the water, not diving until I knew the depth. There were nights, of course, when memory rushed back, sharp and sudden, but those moments lost their authority. They were memories, not mandates. The slideshow I'd made became an artifact. I kept to remind myself of the line I would not allow crossed again, not a weapon, but a lesson in the value of attention, to read the small signs, to trust the wrestle in the corner of the room before it becomes a fire. Ultimately, the revenge I'd crafted was not about making them suffer, but about refusing to be small anymore. It was about choosing dignity over vindication and truth over tidy narratives. When I finally deleted the last copy of that folder a year later, after healing had done more than any public humiliation ever could, it felt less like erasing and more like closing a door behind me. I stepped forward into a life that was quieter, truer, and entirely my own. And for the first time since the announcement at dinner, I felt something like peace.